majority of the cabinet decide that the president is disabled, and if 2/3 of both houses of Congress deem the president to be unable to discharge his powers, then the vice president becomes acting president. So to bring it up to date, if, let's say, for some reason, Vice President Pence decides that President Trump cannot discharge his powers and duties, and if a majority of the cabinet agrees, and if 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate agree, then Pence would become acting president, even against the will of Trump. So that's a rather interesting scenario. Let's hope it never comes to that. Okay, so let's now continue with looking at successive presidents. When Lyndon Johnson was walking across the tarmac towards a departing helicopter, an officer caught up with him and told him, "No, you're going the wrong way." And Johnson said, he said to the president, "Your helicopter is over there." And Johnson stopped the officer and he said, "Son, they're all my helicopters," he replied. And that was Johnson's expansive view of executive authority. When Richard Nixon arrived at the White House, he had an even more expansive view of presidential authority. He systematically went about trying to strengthen the office of president, frequently by circumventing the Constitution or by expanding on past practices that was somewhat questionable. Nixon was the first Republican president since Teddy Roosevelt to embrace a more expansive presidency. He was a man of many contradictions, as illustrated in this cartoon after his death. It shows Nixon approaching St. Peter's, and St. Peter's has two folders in front of him, the good Nixon and the bad Nixon. And he tells the angel, "Cancel my appointments. This one may take a while." Like many who came before him, Nixon believed that in times of war, the president could assume extraordinary powers. He believed that the president's war powers gave him the right to act unilaterally without congressional approval. And so in March of 1969, Nixon expanded the Vietnam War by secretly ordering the bombing of enemy sanctuaries in Cambodia. In May of 1970, he upped the ante by ordering American ground troops into Cambodia. And all this was done without consultation or approval from Congress. And that sparked widespread demonstrations, and student protesters at Kent State and Jackson State were killed by National Guardsmen during those protests. Nixon also ordered logistical, aerial, and artillery support for South Vietnamese forces to invade neighboring Laos in 1971. Now, Congress tried to fight back. The Senate voted to repeal the Tonkin Gulf Resolution and passed an amendment to deny funds for military operations in Cambodia. But while these passed the Senate, the House voted these measures down. Nixon remained unrepentant in his exercise of unilateral foreign policy powers. In 1973, Congress tried to limit the president's war powers by passing the War Powers Resolution. And what this resolution said was that a president can order American troops into battle for no more than 60 days. And after the 60 days, he must get congressional approval. Nixon vetoed the law, and Congress overrode the veto. And so here, once again, the president must notify Congress within 48 hours of committing armed forces to military actions, and it forbids armed forces from remaining in action for more than 60 days without congressional authorization or a declaration of war by Congress. It seemed as if Congress had successfully limited the war-making powers of the president, but successive presidents violated this act. Although Congress disapproved of all such incidents, there has been no successful legal action taken against the president for violating this War Powers Act of 1973. Even Nixon's famous trip to China in 1972 was planned in secrecy and carried out without consulting either Congress or even Nixon's own State Department. In a 1977 interview with David Frost, Nixon declared that when it comes to issues related to national security, quote, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal. Well, that is a very controversial view of presidential powers. Nixon had an equally expansive view of his powers in domestic affairs as well. He used emergency and military forces to control anti-war demonstrators and to persecute those political opponents on his infamous enemies list. He used the FBI to conduct warrantless wiretaps, break-ins, and interceptions of the mail. He used the National Security Agency to conduct electronic surveillance on civil rights and anti-war activists. He used the CIA to compile dossiers on some 7,200 American citizens and authorized the CIA to conduct break-ins, to open mail, and to tap phones. He ordered the CIA to investigate possible foreign links to domestic protesters, despite a legal ban on such CIA operations inside the United States. And he ordered the CIA to aid the Watergate plumbers by providing them with disguises, false identity documents, and electronic equipment. Now, these methods were not invented by Nixon. Lyndon Johnson was an especially enthusiastic consumer of both domestic surveillance and personal intelligence gathering. But Nixon was the first president to claim that such surveillance was within the powers granted to the president. His Attorney General, John Mitchell, claimed that unilateral presidential power extended to wiretapping any group that the president believed was seeking to subvert the government. John Ehrlichman testified that the plumbers' activities were, quote, well within the president's inherent constitutional powers because they were conducted in response to national security concerns. Now, during the recent impeachment trial in February, Alan Dershowitz made a similar claim that a president can do anything he wants as long as the president deems it is in the national interest. Again, a very controversial contention. Nixon wanted to reduce government spending, but he faced a Democratic Congress. He called for budget caps, but when Congress refused, Nixon impounded funds passed by Congress. Impoundment is an act by a president where he decides not to spend money that has already been appropriated by Congress. Thomas Jefferson was the first president to exercise this power of impoundment back in 1801, but Nixon was far more aggressive in his use of impoundment than any of his predecessors. By 1973, he had impounded as much as $15 billion in order to eliminate programs he didn't like, such as loans for rural electrification and funds for wetlands protection. When he vetoed the Federal Water Pollution Control Act amendment, Congress overrode his veto, so Nixon impounded more than half of the funds that had been allocated for that purpose. When Congress appropriated funds to continue the Office for Economic Opportunity, the agency that was responsible for the war on poverty, Nixon refused to spend those funds, and he issued orders to dismantle the OEO. But President Nixon's attempt to impound appropriated funds for the OEO was ruled unconstitutional by a federal judge. So impoundment is another way that presidents have tried to increase their powers beyond that which is specifically enumerated in Article 2 of the Constitution. In the end, it was Nixon's unprecedented usurpation of power that eventually forced him to resign from the presidency. He invoked an absolute executive privilege in carrying out the Saturday Night Massacre, you may remember, where he fired Attorney General Richardson, among others. He also claimed executive privilege in response to the Senate investigating committee demanding that he turn over the tapes. He claimed executive privilege to the Watergate grand jury and to the House Judiciary Committee. Now, historically, presidents had always claimed that their confidential discussions and papers were exempt from examination by the other branches of government. But Nixon was the first president to argue that executive privilege had no limits. He conflated legitimate national security interests with his own political interests of staying in power. When Nixon claimed executive privilege in refusing to turn over the tapes to the special prosecutor, the Supreme Court rejected his claim to absolute executive privilege. The court argued that the tapes did not involve issues of national security. And as we know, Nixon was forced to turn over the tapes, and that led to his decision to resign. In 1973, presidential historian Arthur Schlesinger wrote The Imperial Presidency, arguing that the presidency was becoming uncontrollable and that it had exceeded its constitutional limits. Schlesinger regarded the expansion and abuse of presidential powers as detrimental and dangerous. He argued that the executive branch was violating the intent of the framers of the Constitution through executive privilege, impoundment, electronic surveillance, all of which Schlesinger claimed threatened to make the president somewhat like an emperor or imperial. He pointed out that Congress has three basic powers. Congress has war-making powers, that is, the power to declare war. Congress has power of the purse, that is, to decide on what federal funds should be spent, and investigative powers. And he pointed out that Nixon violated all three of these powers of Congress in the Watergate scandal and in extending the war into Cambodia and Laos. The Watergate scandal provoked Congress to strike back, and Congress then passed a multitude of laws intended to curb the powers of the president. And so among these laws was the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act of 1974 that required the president to obtain congressional approval before impounding any funds. The Case Act of 1972 required that all executive agreements with foreign governments must be reported to Congress. The 1974 Hughes-Ryan Amendment required that the president must report all covert actions of the CIA to congressional committees. The previously mentioned War Powers Act of 1973 limited the president's power to send troops into battle. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978, or FISA, created a court to oversee requests for surveillance warrants by federal law enforcement and intelligence agencies. And of course, the impeachment proceedings itself was Congress's most powerful weapon intended to rein in a president who had clearly abused and overstepped his constitutional authority. Taken together, Vietnam and Watergate shook public trust in government and in the executive branch in particular. So consider this. In a 1960 poll, more than 70% of respondents said they felt that the government did what is right all or most of the time. 70% in 1960. By 1980, only 30% thought that the government did what was right all or most of the time. In 1959, when asked whether the president or Congress should have the most say in government, 61% said that the president should have the most say, only 17% favored Congress. But in a similar survey in 1977, only 26% said the president should have the dominant say, whereas 58% supported congressional dominance. So this is a dramatic shift in public opinion. Scholars and the public began to condemn the excess of presidential power and demanded that those powers be reined in. After Nixon, Congress was determined to reestablish itself as an equal, if not dominant, partner in governing the nation. When Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford became the first and thus far only president never to have been elected either president or vice president. He was Nixon's vice president only because Spiro Agnew had resigned. Now, Ford's tenure as president was particularly challenging because never before had a vice president succeeded to the presidency when a reigning president had resigned. Ford became president when the country was still deeply divided and scarred over the Vietnam War, at a time when respect for the office of the presidency had been greatly diminished, and when the nation's economy was beleaguered by inflation. Ford made an earnest attempt to restore integrity to the presidency and to open the doors of the recently isolated White House. He invited Congress to a summit on the economy. He granted amnesty to draft evaders and deserters of the Vietnam War. And he received a 71% approval rating in just his first week in office. But 3 weeks later, when he granted Nixon a full, free, and absolute pardon, his standing with the public crumbled. The press, which earlier celebrated his unpretentious personal style, now transformed him into an object of ridicule and scorn. He was now characterized as a clumsy, slow-witted bumbler. Some of you may remember the way Saturday Night Live and Chevy Chase characterized President Ford. Ford was unable to restore the power and prestige of the modern presidency. He proved unable to work with a hostile Congress that was dominated by Democrats. He issued 66 vetoes in less than 3 years in office, the sixth most of any president. From the moment he pardoned Nixon, a kind of open warfare developed between Ford and Congress. Congress refused his request for emergency aid to the disintegrating government of South Vietnam. Now, he was able to restore some dignity to the presidency after Nixon's disgrace, but Ford was really more of a clerk rather than a leader. In fact, he himself confessed, "I am a Ford, not a Lincoln." When Jimmy Carter became president in 1977, he also had a terrible time with Congress, even though Congress was controlled by members of his own Democratic Party. Carter had been a one-term governor who was virtually unknown outside of Georgia before he ran for president. But in 1977, being an outsider was an asset, and he was not tainted by the evils of Washington politics associated with Watergate. In addition, he was an effective campaigner, presenting himself to voters as a moral and trustworthy leader at a time of widespread disillusionment with dishonesty in government. But he was not able to articulate a sense of purpose or overall vision, and he failed to inspire the public. Moreover, he had little success in courting Congress and in winning support for his legislative agenda. He did score a diplomatic triumph with the signing of the Camp David Accords in 1978 that led to a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. But he wasn't able to overcome two setbacks in the last 2 years of his presidency. The wildly inflationary oil embargo led to tremendous increases in the price of gasoline, in the United States, and he was blamed for that. And of course, his failure to rescue the Iranian hostages, the failed rescue attempt. As a result, Carter was never able to overcome the public image as a weak and indecisive leader, and he was trounced by Ronald Reagan in the 1980 presidential election. After Vietnam and Watergate, and the weak presidencies of Ford and Carter, people once again began to hunger for strong leadership to solve problems and to flex American muscle abroad. And many came to regard Reagan as the strong, effective, popular leader who could restore the presidency to its pre-Watergate status. As the first truly conservative since the 1920s, Reagan's landslide victory in 1980 was dubbed the Reagan Revolution. He brought to the executive office rhetorical gifts that earned him the title the Great Communicator. And like Woodrow Wilson and Theodore and Roosevelt and FDR and JFK, Reagan articulated a vision that inspired the nation. He was the first president in more than 50 years to call for limited government, famously claiming in his inaugural address that government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. He challenged the fundamental principle of the New Deal, that it is the government's responsibility to promote the welfare of the American people. Such a powerful government, Reagan contended, strips people of their self-reliance and dignity. As president, he concentrated on two themes: shrinking the welfare state and expanding the military. Towards these ends, he promoted a large income tax cut, a major reduction in spending on social programs such as Social Security and Medicare, and an enormous increase in defense spending. And he demonstrated the ability to work with Congress to cut taxes, to reduce domestic expenditure, and to increase defense spending. But along the way, his program saddled the country with the largest budget deficit in American history. He expanded presidential powers when it came to foreign policy, largely by ignoring restrictions imposed by Congress. And so in 1983, he disregarded the War Powers Act when he ordered an invasion of the Caribbean island of Grenada. He did that without consulting Congress. In 1986, he ordered the bombing of Libya in retaliation for terrorist attacks on American soldiers in West Germany. But even though he violated the War Powers Act, Congress did not protest these actions because the duration of these military acts was brief, and there were very few casualties, and these operations were successful. Reagan seemed unwilling to accept limits placed upon his office, and he and members of his administration went beyond the law in what became known as the Iran-Contra scandal. In the early 1980s, the Reagan administration wanted to support right-wing rebels known as Contras, who were trying to overthrow a Marxist regime in Nicaragua. But Congress didn't want to get involved in another Vietnam-like situation. And so Congress passed a law prohibiting aid to the Contras. Nevertheless, the Reagan administration secretly funded the Contras with money from the sale of weapons to Iran, which was a clear violation of the congressional ban. When the Iran-Contra affair became public, Reagan's approval rating dropped 21% in just 1 month, and the scandal weakened Reagan in the last 2 years of his administration. When the scandal broke, Reagan literally became paralyzed. He became so withdrawn that Chief of Staff Howard Baker even considered invoking the 25th Amendment to remove a disabled president. Reagan's devotion to conservative ideology led him to rely on unilateral executive action, bypassing Congress by issuing executive orders intended to weaken environmental protection and civil rights regulations. But Reagan was an enormously popular president who helped to revive the spirit and confidence of the American people. But like John F. Kennedy, his presidency was shaped more by image than by substance. Reagan's greatest achievement was working with Gorbachev and helping to end the Cold War, but he was less successful in other ways. He promised greatness, but left the economy in shambles with a wider gap between the rich and poor than before he entered the White House. He attacked big government, but he actually added to the size of government during his presidency. He condemned deficits, but then he presided over the biggest budget deficit ever. And like Nixon, he displayed a distinct lack of respect for the law by attempting to impose a new imperial presidency. His administration was nearly destroyed over the Iran-Contra scandal. In the end, he left the office of the presidency weaker than when he took office. The presidency of his successor, George Herbert Walker Bush, was marked by triumph in foreign affairs and failure in domestic policy. The first President Bush invaded Panama to remove from power the anti-American dictator, General Manuel Noriega. This was the largest American military effort since the Vietnam War. And the first President Bush oversaw the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Bush won just narrow approval from Congress in using military force to drive Iraq out of Kuwait in the first Gulf War. Now, he asserted that he would have sent troops in even without congressional approval, and he maintained that the War Powers Act of 1973 was unconstitutional. But it was his domestic failures that made him just a one-term president. He had no discernible domestic agenda and no clear set of beliefs. He went back on his promise not to raise taxes. Remember, he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." But he eventually called for increased taxes. And the budget deficit continued to rise during his presidency. So his style of leadership was more reactive than proactive. He was really a managerial president rather than a leader. The first 2 years of Bill Clinton's presidency were terribly unsuccessful. He won the 1992 election with only 43% of the popular vote, which was hardly a mandate. You may remember that Ross Perot ran as a very strong third-party candidate. Clinton learned the limits of presidential power early on when he announced that he intended to issue an executive order to lift the ban on gays and lesbians in the military. But that provoked a powerful opposition in Congress, and it forced Clinton to back off, and he settled for don't ask, don't tell. During Clinton's first term, Democrats had majorities in both houses, but Republican senators resorted to filibusters to thwart Clinton's proposal for assistance for low-income families. And the Congress opposed Clinton's 1993 proposal for healthcare reform. And congressional opposition impacted Clinton's foreign policy as well. When he decided to capture a Somali warlord that resulted in the death of 18 American servicemen, you may remember Black Hawk Down. After that, he was forced to curtail the mission when Congress threatened to cut off funding. And when Republicans took control of Congress after the 1994 election, opposition to Clinton grew even more formidable. But Clinton was more successful in exerting presidential authority in his second term in office, and that earned him the title the comeback kid. Republicans in Congress blocked virtually every item in his legislative agenda. And as a result, Clinton then issued a blizzard of executive orders and proclamations on tobacco regulation, environmental protection, and he did this without the blessing of Congress. In 1999, he withstood a House resolution against a bombing campaign in Kosovo, and he went ahead and ordered the bombing anyway, forcing Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic to end the ethnic cleansing of Muslims in Kosovo and accepting a peace treaty. But overall, Congress and the courts weakened executive authority during the Clinton years. In 1996, the Supreme Court declared Clinton's line item veto unconstitutional. And in 1997, in the case of Clinton v. Jones, the Supreme Court rejected the president's claim of immunity against a sexual harassment lawsuit, a ruling that established that even sitting presidents are subject to civil suits. And of course, in 1998, Clinton became the only elected president to be, well, he became the second president, the only elected president to be impeached, because in the case of Andrew Johnson, Andrew Johnson was not an elected president. Andrew Johnson became president after Lincoln was assassinated. But Clinton became the first elected president to be impeached. It began as an investigation of financial dealings in Arkansas real estate, but it wound up with the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Clinton invoked executive privilege in order to keep aides and Secret Service agents from testifying before a grand jury, but an appeals court ruled against the president. He was ultimately impeached on counts for perjury and obstruction of justice, but he was acquitted by senators who largely voted along party lines. When Clinton's administration achieved a strong economy with a budget surplus, impeachment added to the declining prestige of the post-Watergate presidency. George Bush, the second Bush, assumed the presidency in January of 2001, and 9 months later, the 9/11 attack immediately launched another imperial presidency. Bush proclaimed a national emergency and declared a war on terror, which he said begins with Al-Qaeda, but does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. A week later, Congress passed a joint resolution, the authorization for use of military force, to authorize force against those responsible for attacking the United States on 9/11. 3 weeks later, the United States, along with Britain, invaded Afghanistan and attacked the Taliban, the Islamic fundamentalist regime that had harbored Al-Qaeda. The war against the Taliban is now entering its 18th year, and talks are going on at this very moment to end that conflict. The Bush administration claimed that Iraq's Saddam Hussein was somehow linked to the 9/11 attack and that he was developing weapons of mass destruction. In October of 2002, Congress overwhelmingly adopted a resolution to authorize the use of force against Saddam. And in March of 2003, US forces bombed and invaded Iraq. In October of 2001, Congress passed the Patriot Act, empowering the executive branch to intercept telephone calls and emails, to enter homes and businesses to search for financial records, and to detain and deport immigrants. And so 9/11 really led to a dramatic increase in presidential powers. Bush unilaterally called for military tribunals to try suspected foreign terrorists and to allow investigators to listen in on lawyer-client conversations. So as a result of all of this, thousands of suspected terrorists were held in military custody, more than 600 at Guantanamo. They were labeled unlawful enemy combatants without any rights that prisoners of war might have. They were imprisoned for an indefinite time without any formal charges being brought against them, even if they were American citizens. Bush claimed it was entirely up to him, not to the courts, not to Congress, but up to him to determine who was an enemy combatant. And that decision would not be reviewable by any other branch of government, he contended. Now, some legal scholars questioned Bush's claim to unilateral power as commander-in-chief in the war on terror. They debated his authorization of warrantless wiretaps inside the United States. They contested the secret kidnappings of terrorist suspects and the use of torture in investigations. Those who defended Bush did so according to the unitary executive theory. This maintains that since the Constitution assigns the president all the executive power, then the president can set aside laws that attempt to limit his power when it comes to national security, and that such broad presidential powers are necessary to defend the nation against the threat of terrorism, even without having to answer to a judge. And so supporters of broad presidential power claim it is actually dangerous to limit the president's powers in a post-9/11 America. Now, Congress and most Americans agreed that the president's powers should be increased in response to 9/11. But in the second term of the Bush administration, Congress began to have second thoughts. No weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq, and Bush's claim to mission accomplished proved premature at best. In addition, the nation was shocked by photographs of the humiliation and torture of prisoners and kidnappings at so-called black sites. The courts repeatedly scolded the Bush administration for its handling of detainees in the war on terror. And US troops continued to die in Iraq and Afghanistan, and public trust in the presidency began to erode. Such growing dissatisfaction was a major factor in Barack Obama's victory in the 2008 presidential election. Obama took office promising to curtail Bush's overreach, but Obama's record was a mixed bag. He banned torture, but he declined to punish anyone because of it. He continued massive surveillance, as revealed by Edward Snowden. Obama also asserted the right to kill American citizens overseas without a trial. As a candidate for president in 2007, Obama recognized that presidents could not order the use of force unless the country was attacked or was faced with imminent attack. However, as president, he ordered military strikes outside this emergency context. In 2011, he ordered a bombing campaign against Libya, a country that was hardly a threat to the United States. And he insisted he did not require congressional authorization to order that attack. Early in his second term, he announced that the global war on terror was over and the end of the combat role of the United States-led mission in Afghanistan was over. However, the unexpected rise of ISIS led to a new operation against terrorists in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. Obama used the original 2001 AUMF congressional authorization to justify attacks on ISIS. But ISIS didn't even exist when Congress passed the 2001 authorization. Obama also has ordered drone strikes without congressional approval. But then he blinked when it came to Syria. He decided then that he could not launch airstrikes on the Assad regime without congressional approval. And to demonstrate how obsolete congressional authorization had become, Obama was widely ridiculed for even asking Congress's approval for strikes against Syria. Now, Obama never formally subscribed to the unitary executive theory. Compared with most presidents of the past half century, and especially with his predecessor, George W. Bush, Barack Obama was restrained about asserting inherent executive power under the Constitution. As I mentioned, he refused to attack Syria without congressional authorization. He also wanted to close the prison camp in Guantanamo, but was stymied by Republican opposition. Now, while most presidents tried to increase their powers incrementally, President Trump has done so exponentially and in somewhat questionable ways. Obama used executive authorities to achieve results he failed to get through Congress. And so all of these were the result of executive orders. The Dreamers Act, or DACA, to allow more than 200,000 young undocumented aliens to stay in the United States. That was the result of President Obama's executive order. He also issued executive orders on healthcare, gun control, energy, the environment, education, among others. But President Trump has relied on executive orders to reverse many of those that Obama issued by cracking down on immigration, by restricting travel from mostly Muslim countries, and by rolling back safeguards on the environment. Trump has issued 170 executive orders in his 3.5 years in office, compared to 108 executive orders in Obama's first 3.5 years in office. Now, critics charge that Trump has exercised an unchecked authority that has transformed him into a virtual autocrat, and that he has done so largely with the consent of Congress. Well, what are some of the specifics that have been cited in Trump's unchecked authority? Well, for example, by calling a national emergency in order to move forward with construction of a border wall, even without explicit congressional support. Trump's Justice Department has affirmed that he cannot be indicted for obstructing justice in the Russian investigation, which essentially means that a sitting president is above the law. Trump and his appointees routinely disdain congressional oversight and ignore congressional subpoenas with impunity. Trump has refused to disclose his tax returns, despite Congress's statutory right to secure them. He has barred government officials from testifying before Congress. He has separated immigrant families at the border. He has been guilty of possible violations of the Emoluments Clause. More blatant yet is his assertion of a right to accept dirt on political opponents from foreign governments, and his personal attacks on judges who dare subject the acts of the administration to judicial review. He disdains the warnings of his own intelligence appointees concerning Russian intrusion into the 2016 presidential election. He has called the press enemies of the people. He has aided the Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen without congressional authority. But Congress itself has enabled Trump to enhance these presidential powers. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has blocked 2 pieces of legislation designed to safeguard our elections in 2020, laws that would require paper ballots and voting machines, and thus not depend entirely on the internet, by refusing to call witnesses at the impeachment trial, and by resisting the use of oversight responsibilities. Now, past presidents have frequently pushed the limits of their power beyond what the Constitution intended. But what distinguishes Trump from his predecessors is that he has expanded many presidential powers to serve purely personal ends. He seems to be pushing against the limits of presidential power almost entirely to protect himself and to promote his self-interest. So, in conclusion to these 4 lectures on the expansion of presidential power, the modern vision of the presidency could not be further from what the founding fathers envisioned the role of the chief executive to be. The architects of the Constitution never conceived of the president as the man who should be in charge of the nation's destiny. But throughout the 20th century, More and more Americans look to the central government to deal with highly visible public problems, from labor disputes to civil war, from economic depression to natural disasters. And presidents have assumed increased power in order to deal with such crises. All presidents try to push the limits of their power. Presidential power is a necessity, but it's up to the other two branches of government to push back. Congress in the post-9/11 era is not pushing back on executive power as much as it should. It is really ignoring its responsibility to oversee the executive branch of government. Increasingly, Congress has abdicated its constitutional role to keep presidents from abusing their powers. For example, the 1976 National Emergencies Act requires the president to spell out reasons for declaring a national emergency. And after 6 months, Congress can terminate that emergency. But despite the declaration of 58 national emergencies by presidents since that act was passed, Congress has only responded to one. Another example, Congress has the power to declare war. Yet almost every president since the end of World War II has committed American troops to battle without congressional approval. If a sitting president is above the law, and if Congress and the courts refuse to implement their checks on presidential power, then I fear that the future of democracy in America might well be in doubt. Well, on that not too optimistic note, that concludes my thoughts and observations about the increase of presidential powers. And